"Shut the fuck up, boy, hands where I can see them." The words rip through the night like shattered glass. The black father freezes behind the wheel, knuckles white on the steering wheel, sweat sliding down his temple. A flashlight beam blinds his eyes. Boots crunch gravel. Another voice, colder. "Don't move, don't even breathe." The air is thick, suffocating. Sirens echo faintly in the distance, then die into silence. The only sound is breath, sharp, uneven, trembling. A fist slams against the window, glass spiderwebs fragments glinting under the red-blue strobe. He gasps, blood dripping where shards cut into his cheek. The dashcam light blinks on, off. Each flicker captures terror in frozen frames. Hands yank the door open. He's dragged into the night. Gravel scrapes his back. Boots hammer down ribs, crack. His scream muffled by another blow. "Stop resisting." The officer roars, though the man's body is limp, hands raised in surrender. Shadows close in. One cop pins his throat with a knee. Another smashes his head against asphalt. His voice breaks. "Please, I got a son." Silence answers. A gunshot, deafening, final. The sound lingers, then dissolves into the hum of cicadas and the faint wheeze of broken breath fading into nothing. The dashcam flickers again, blinking, recording, failing. On the roadside, his body lies still, framed in headlights, blood pooling toward the gutter. What remains is not just a corpse but a legacy of rage. Somewhere, his son will inherit the silence, the shadow, the vow that begins here. Welcome to Craze TV. Tell me, where in the world are you watching this story from right now? The blood on the road had not yet dried, but to understand the weight of what was taken, you have to return to the days before, when the world was still intact, when silence meant peace, not death. The father was a man of small rituals. Every evening, before the sky folded into night, he would set the table in their modest home. Plates chipped from years of use, forks clinking against worn wood, laughter drifting from the kitchen where his son teased him about burning the rice again. There was no grandeur, no riches, just rhythm, a pot simmering, the crackle of oil. The son's voice filling the room with stories half true, half wild, and in those moments, the father's eyes softened, shadows lifting. His life was hard, yes, but here, inside these four walls, there was light. The son had inherited something different, not just his father's stubbornness or crooked smile, but something darker. He lived in a world where silence could be bought, where men shook hands under neon lights in back rooms thick with smoke. A world of ledgers hidden in plain sight, of debts collected with quiet precision. The city knew him as something else entirely, a name whispered in bars, feared in alleys, respected in boardrooms where the law never entered. But at home, with his father, he wasn't a mafia prince. He was a son, carrying groceries in one arm, dropping cash in a jar they called the dream fund. A promise, maybe, for a car the old man wanted but never dared to buy. The nights were steady, but not unmarked by unease. The father drove like a man, always rehearsing for disaster, both hands firm at 10 and 2, eyes flicking between mirrors, breath pausing at every set of flashing lights behind him. The son noticed. He always noticed. "Relax, Pops," he would mutter, forcing a grin. But the father's silence answered more than words ever could. On quiet drives home, the tension was alive, visible only in small gestures. The father's fingers tapping against the wheel, his shoulders tightening at sirens in the distance, his breath catching before easing when police cruisers passed by without stopping. It was as if he knew, as if he had always known, something waited for him on the roadside. Inside, though laughter drowned the paranoia, they argued over who cooked better chicken. The father swore his seasoning was unmatched. The son claimed his pasta could make an Italian weep. The TV buzzed in the background, some old sitcom rerun filling the gaps. The son leaned back, stretched his legs, and for a moment, just a moment, his world of shadows vanished. He was only a boy again, raised on his father's tired wisdom. And the father, scarred by years of struggle, saw his son not as a criminal, not as an heir to violence, but as the only good thing he had ever truly done right. Yet the unease never fully left. When the father kissed his son goodnight, his eyes lingered at the door, as though measuring how many tomorrows he had left. When the son watched his father fall asleep on the couch, remote in hand, he caught the sound of restless breathing, of dreams unsettled. And when their laughter died down into silence, that silence was never empty. It carried weight. It carried warnings. This was the life that made the coming tragedy unbearable. A table set for two. A jar filled with dreams. A bond stitched by laughter, tested by shadows, held together by love. Ordinary life, so painfully ordinary. And yet, beneath the warmth, something always waited. In the father's cautious glances, in the son's quiet suspicion, in the way silence stretched too long between them, as though both were holding their breath against a future they couldn't name. Because tragedy does not arrive unannounced. It lingers, it waits, it watches you laugh at the dinner table, and when it finally strikes, you realize the warning signs were always there, in the tapping fingers. In the breath it caught too soon, in the way headlights in the mirror turned an ordinary drive into a rehearsal for death. The warning signs had always been there, the tapping fingers, the caught breaths, the headlights in the mirror. And then one night they arrived. Rain fell in slow sheets, a steady whisper against the windshield. The father drove with both hands gripping the wheel, knuckles pale beneath brown skin, wipers scraped across glass, keeping time like a metronome, back and forth, back and forth. The road stretched ahead, empty except for the glow of distant streetlights. His breathing was shallow, uneven, each exhale fogging the glass. He should have been home by now. He should have been at the table waiting for his son to return. Instead, red and blue tore through the darkness. A siren's wail cut the air, sharp, unnatural, splitting silence into shards. He pulled over, slowly, carefully, every move deliberate, rehearsed like a man stepping into a role he had dreaded his whole life. The cruiser stopped behind him. 2 doors slammed, boots splashed into shallow puddles. Flashlight beams cut through the rain, harsh and white, blinding. License and registration. A voice barked, rough with authority, rougher with contempt. The father's hands shook as he reached toward the glove box. His heart thudded, heavy, echoing inside his chest. Keep your hands where I can see them. Another voice, higher, younger, edged with impatience. I'm not, he began, but the words broke against the storm. Step out of the car, he obeyed. Rain slicked his face as he stepped into the night. His shirt clung to his skin, his breath misting in the air. The flashlight beam never left his eyes. He raised his hands high, palms open. I got a son, he whispered, voice cracking. Just trying to get home. The officers circled him, wolves closing in. One pushed him toward the hood, metal biting his chest, cold water seeping into his clothes. Stop resisting, the first cop shouted, though he hadn't moved. A fist slammed into his ribs. He coughed, gagged, air stolen from his lungs. Another blow cracked against his jaw. His teeth clinked together, blood flooding his mouth. The dashcam blinked on, off, recording fragments of violence, then static. His knees buckled, gravel cutting into skin as they shoved him down. A boot pressed into his spine, grinding bone against pavement. He gasped, rain filling his throat. He tried to speak, but another strike silenced him. His words bled into a groan. Another officer leaned close, knee pinning his neck, pressure crushing, the sound of breath turning ragged, strangled, resisting arrest. One muttered, almost rehearsed, as if the words themselves were part of the script. His body jerked, weak, desperate. His fingers clawed against asphalt slick with rain and blood. A crack rang out glass, bone, something breaking. Blurred, headlights bleeding into the night like halos. Please, he whispered, voice barely audible, swallowed by thunder. I just want to go home for a moment. Silence answered. Then the gunshot. The sound split the world open, deafening, irreversible. His body went still, collapsing against the asphalt. Rain pattered over him, turning red as blood spread in thin streams toward the gutter. His chest rose once, then again, weaker, then stopped. The blinking dashcam flickered, capturing the final twitch of his fingers, the half-open eyes staring into storm clouds above. His last breath hung in the air like smoke, dissolving into nothing. The officers stood over him, shadows framed in blue light. Their radios crackled with static. One muttered. Suspect reached for a weapon, but the truth lay silent on the ground, an unarmed man, rain washing his blood into the cracks of the road. His body was left in headlights, a silhouette carved into memory. What remained wasn't only death. It was a wound, deep and festering, that would not heal. Somewhere his son would hear the news. Somewhere a home would go silent, the table set for two waiting for a man who would never return. And in that silence, rage would be born. Rage sharp enough to cut through shadows. Rage patient enough to hunt. Rage heavy enough to drown an entire town in violence. The night had taken a father, but in doing so, it had awakened something far darker in the son. The tragedy was not just the death itself. It was the inheritance, the way blood on the road would seep into another man's hands, demanding vengeance, demanding more blood, and once awakened, there would be no turning back. The night had taken a father, and by morning, the machine began its work. The first report arrived before dawn. A single sheet of paper, words chosen like weapons. Traffic stop escalated. Suspect resisted. Officers responded with appropriate force. The word suspect replaced his name, his history, his family, his humanity, or erased in 3 lines of bureaucratic ink. By noon, the bodycam footage had malfunctioned. 2 devices, both cutting out at the same time, blinking lights fading into black, as if violence itself had reached into the circuitry and silenced the truth. A coincidence, I said, a technical error, but the silence was too perfect, too convenient. At the coroner's office, another truth was smothered. The autopsy report claimed internal bleeding consistent with substance use, though no drugs were found. Broken ribs became minor abrasions, a bullet wound described as unclear cause of death. The family was given nothing, no clarity, only a sealed envelope and a hollow warning: don't ask too many questions, let it rest. The district attorney stepped before cameras with polished calm, his tie straight, his voice rehearsed. This is a tragedy, he said, eyes heavy with false sympathy. But let me be clear, the officers followed procedure. We asked the community to remain peaceful while the investigation continues. There was no investigation, only a performance. A curtain pulled down to hide the blood on the stage. The media obeyed. Headlines blared across the town. Aggressive driver shot after attacking police officers, feared for their lives. A photograph of the father appeared cropped from an old mugshot. Years forgotten, dragged from archives to poison the public eye. Not the man at the dinner table, not the father laughing over burnt rice. Just a distorted shadow reshaped into the story they needed. But whispers fought against the noise. Neighbors spoke of headlights they'd seen, of voices carried on rain, of a man begging, "I got a son." Their words spread through church basements, barbershops, corners where cameras never reached. Yet witnesses were visited, quiet knocks at doors, subtle threats. "Are you sure you saw what you think you saw?" One woman found her tires slashed after speaking to a reporter. Another received a letter with no signature, only the words, "Mind your own business." One by one, voices went silent. The town became divided by truth and narrative. On one side, the official record, a violent black man, unpredictable, a threat to officers' lives. On the other, the memories of those who knew him, a father cautious behind the wheel, a man who whispered prayers before meals, a life ended not by resistance but by routine. The weight of contradiction pressed down on every street. Posters with his face were torn from walls. Murals painted in his honor were defaced overnight, each act erasing him further as though his existence itself were inconvenient. Inside police headquarters, the cover-up grew roots, reports edited, timelines shifted, officers coached on what to say. He reached for something, we gave repeated warnings. Every word rehearsed, repeated until it hardened into truth. The machine did not falter. It never does. And yet, the blinking light remained. Somewhere in an evidence locker, one camera still held fragments. Glimpses of rain, shadows, a man raising his hands. The footage flickered, corrupted, unreliable but alive, blinking on, off, as if the truth itself refused to die completely. But for the family, there was no justice, only silence. The son read the headlines, hands trembling. He saw his father's name, twisted, dragged through mud, reshaped into a criminal he was not. He stared at the DA's press conference, at the cops standing unshaken, their uniforms pressed, their lives unchanged, and in that silence, something shifted. Grief hardened into fury, fury sharpened into resolve. The system had killed his father once on the roadside. Now it killed him again, erasing him in ink, burying him beneath lies. The son understood the truth. There would be no justice from above. If it was to come, it would have to come from the shadows. And he already knew how to live there. The machine had buried the truth. The officers were free. The headlines were written. The town was silenced. But the son was not. Grief hit him like a collapse, sudden and merciless. He didn't eat for 2 days. Plates sat untouched on the table, food growing cold, flies gathering in silence. He smoked through the nights, cigarettes burning to ash between his fingers until the room filled with haze. Bottles lined the counter, glass reflecting the low light of the lamp that never shut off. When he finally slept, it wasn't rest. It was torment. In dreams, his father came back not whole, not alive, but broken. He saw him on the roadside, headlights burning behind him. He heard the words again, "Hands where I can see them," followed by fists, glass, blood. Every night the dream ended with the gunshot. The sound woke him, jerking him from the couch, drenched in sweat, chest heaving. His heart beat so hard he thought it might tear through his ribs. And always, in the corner of the room, shadows lingered. They shifted when he blinked. They breathed when he didn't. At first he told himself it was grief, paranoia. But the longer he stared, the more real they seemed, dark forms watching, waiting, pressing against the walls like the town itself was closing in. He stopped answering calls, stopped opening the door. Relatives came, bringing food, prayers, words of comfort, but words slid off him like rain on glass. One uncle tried to console him. "Your father was a good man. God will judge." The son stared at him. Finally, a whisper, "God wasn't there." That was the last time they spoke. He spent hours in front of mirrors, staring at his own reflection, searching, waiting. Sometimes he saw his father's face in the glass, eyes tired, mouth drawn into silence. Other times he saw himself, but distorted, darker, something behind the eyes that didn't belong. Once, unable to bear it, he slammed his fist into the mirror. It cracked, splintering into jagged webs. Blood dripped from his knuckles, falling onto the sink, mixing with water. He watched it swirl down the drain, mesmerized. The broken mirror stayed on the wall, fragments reflecting him in pieces, each shard a version of himself, grieving son, ruthless criminal, something in between. He tried the law at first. He sat in courtrooms, filing appeals, begging attorneys who wouldn't return his calls. He met with reporters who nodded, recorded, then printed nothing. He walked into the DA's office once, demanded answers. The receptionist looked at him like a nuisance. "The case is closed," she said, eyes flat, voice mechanical. Closed. That word burned in him like acid. He left, and something in him snapped. Insomnia took over. Nights stretched long, endless, filled with pacing. He sat by the window, chain-smoking, watching police cruisers roll past his block. He memorized their patterns, the way they slowed at corners, the way their lights flickered just enough to stir the dread in his chest. He thought of his father's words, soft warnings in the car. "Always keep your hands where they can see them. Don't give them a reason." And he realized his father had always been preparing him not for life, but for death. The law wouldn't help. Justice was not coming. What was left was silence. And in that silence, a vow formed. But vows come with cost. Every time he pictured his father's death, rage filled him. But after rage came guilt. What if his father could see him now? What if vengeance stained everything the old man had built? He argued with himself, pacing the room, muttering aloud. They have to pay, then. But what would he want? Then, he wanted to live. They didn't let him. The silence answered. The silence always answered. His body began to wither under the weight of it. Eyes red, skin pale, clothes hanging loose on his frame. He stopped shaving, stopped caring. The house grew darker, curtains drawn, mirrors broken, dishes stacked high with decay. The world outside carried on traffic humming, children laughing, church bells ringing, but in his home, time froze. All he had were shadows. One night, after a bottle too many, he collapsed onto the floor, chest heaving. He thought he felt his father's hand on his shoulder, gentle, steady. He whispered, "What do I do?" No answer came, only silence, only breathing, his own, heavy, broken, filling the room like a confession. In that silence, he understood something bitter. The law was not made for men like his father. It was built to bury them, and blood, his family's blood, had already been spilled. What was one more drop, or two, or 10? The Mafia world that had always hovered on the edge of his life now beckoned him in full. He still had contacts, men who owed him favors, men who could move guns without questions, men who lived in the same shadows he now found himself sinking into. The line between grief and vengeance blurred until there was nothing left but rage with a heartbeat. His father had died on the roadside, begging. The son promised he would not beg, and so, in those sleepless nights, in those cracked mirrors and smoke-filled rooms, desperation reshaped itself into resolve. The breathing grew steadier. The shadows stopped haunting, they became allies, cloaks. The grieving sun began to fade. The hunter began to rise. But the cost was clear. Whatever humanity he still held, whatever softness remained, would not survive what was coming. Justice had been stolen. The system had buried his father. Now he would dig him back up, not with words, not with prayers, but with blood. Desperation had reshaped itself into resolve. But to strike, he needed faces, names, weaknesses, and the system had plenty. The first was Officer Harlan Briggs, tall, broad-shouldered, with the look of a man who had spent his youth throwing punches in bar fights and never unlearned the thrill. At home, he was a father of 3, married to his high school sweetheart, a man who grilled steaks on Sundays, coached Little League, taught his sons to stand tall. But behind the badge, he carried something else: fear. Fear of losing control, fear of the world changing too fast around him, fear that men like the one he shot on that rainy road might rise higher than him. Fear turned into anger, anger turned into violence, and violence, once rewarded, became routine. He told himself he was protecting his family, protecting the badge, but the truth was simpler. He liked the power. The second was Officer Derek O'Neill, younger, quieter, the kind of man who nodded along in silence, letting others speak for him. His record was clean to clean, every complaint against him buried, every accusation dissolved before it left the station. Derek had ambition. He wanted to rise, to climb through ranks, to trade a patrol car for a detective's desk, and in his mind, that meant loyalty, blind loyalty. So when Harlan shouted, "Stop resisting," Derek echoed it. When fists flew, Derek held the man down. When the gunshot cracked the night, Derek told himself it was necessary. Ambition is a dangerous fuel. It burns conscience first. Then there was Officer Mason Clay, the youngest of the three, barely 5 years on the force, still new enough to flinch when sirens cut through the night. Mason wasn't cruel by nature. But cruelty doesn't need nature, it needs silence. And Mason was silent. He stood there as his partners dragged a man from his car. He watched fists fall. He heard the words, "I got a son," and still he said nothing. Silence made him complicit. Silence made him theirs. Later, Mason would drink too much. He would see the man's face in his dreams. He would wake drenched in sweat, convinced headlights were following him. But when the DA called him to testify, he read the script given to him, and his silence deepened. Above them, the system had its keeper, District Attorney Paul Weston. Weston was not a brute, not a man of fists or guns. He was polished, precise, a man who measured his words the way others measured bullets. He had built his career on appearances, safe neighborhoods, rising conviction rates, glossy headlines that made voters feel secure. The death of a black father at the hands of white officers threatened that. It was a crack in the image, a storm on the horizon. Weston didn't see a corpse on the roadside. He saw numbers, polling charts, re-election odds, and so he made his choice. Reports rewritten, footage varied, witnesses intimidated. Justice was not profitable. Stability was. Behind closed doors, he admitted the truth to no one, not even himself. In his mind, he wasn't corrupt, he was pragmatic. He told himself the same lie every man in power repeats: if I don't, someone worse will. Together, they were not cartoon villains. They were not demons. They were fathers, husbands, neighbors, men who bought groceries, paid mortgages, shoveled snow in the winter. But they were also something else. Products of a system that rewarded silence, promoted loyalty, and punished dissent. A system that turned fear into bullets, ambition into complicity, survival into corruption. The son studied them. He learned where Harlan drank, which bar store he claimed as his own. He learned Derek's schedule, the diner where he ate breakfast alone at 6 a.m. before every shift. He learned Mason's routine late-night drives to clear his head, music blaring, windows down, as if running from ghosts. And he learned Weston's patterns, the speeches, the fundraisers, the private dinners with donors who never spoke of blood spilled on asphalt. One by one, the faces hardened in his mind, not faceless uniforms, not abstract corruption, but men, fragile, flawed, living men. And with that knowledge came something colder than grief, resolve. But even as he watched them, he saw the human cracks in their armor. Harlan kissing his kids on the forehead before heading to work. Derek adjusting his tie, staring at himself in the mirror as if convincing his reflection he belonged. Mason pulling over late at night, head in his hands, sobbing quietly where no one could hear. Weston massaging his temples, whispering to his own reflection, "Keep it together." They were human. But humanity did not absolve them. Humanity made them dangerous because it allowed them to justify everything. For the son, that realization cut deep. Killing monsters was easy. Monsters deserved it. Monsters left no doubt. But these weren't monsters. These were men with lives, families, fears of their own. To hunt them would mean crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. To strip away not just their power but their humanity. And in doing so, he risked losing his own. Yet the silence of the system left him no choice. Every headline, every lie, every courtroom shrug reminded him that justice had been buried. The faces of his father's killers were not hidden. They walked freely through town, uniforms pressed, reputations intact. They smiled at neighbors. They shook hands at community events. And his father lay in the ground, painted as a criminal. So the son made his decision. He would not see them as fathers. He would not see them as men. He would see them as what they had become. Extensions of the machine that had murdered his father and buried the truth. Fear, ambition, silence, survival. These were not excuses. They were verdicts. The son's reflection in the broken mirror no longer asked questions. It had only one answer. He had memorized their faces. He had watched their routines. He had traced their weaknesses like a map. The grief that once shattered him became a scalpel cold, precise, purposeful. Where sorrow had left holes, method took shape. The sun moved through the night with the quiet of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. He started in the corners where light didn't reach. A nondescript room above a shuttered storefront, a table, a lamp. The Mafia men who had been background noise his whole life sat across from him, not monsters in fedoras, but businessmen in cheap suits, palms rough, eyes quick. They spoke in low tones, the air thick with smoke and the metallic bite of coffee. They remembered his father for reasons other than headlines. Loyalty counted for something in shadows. He didn't ask for mercy. He asked for tools. Phones that erased themselves. Numbers that vanished. A man who could move a weapon and make it look like it had never been there. A driver with no questions. They obliged because favors are currency in that world. Because the sun paid in something they understood. Reputation, promises, fear. He left lighter. The corners of his mouth hollower. The set of his shoulders straighter. He had allies now, practical, silent, necessary. The planning was antiseptic. He bought burner phones in cash, folding bills into hands that smelled of disinfectant and dust. He traced routes on napkins, circled corners with pens, sketched angles and he wrote names in block letters. Harlan, Derek, Mason, Weston. Each name a target. Each target a calculus of time, place, risk. He rehearsed in the dark. He walked the streets at 2 in the morning, learning which security lights lagged by a fraction, which cameras blinked on a predictable schedule, which patrols took the long route and which took the highway. He learned to read blinking lights the way his father learned to read the road. He watched for the slightest hesitation in a guard's step, the way a man tugs at his wedding band when lying. He kept notes on small paper squares, folded and slipped into the lining of his jacket. Cryptic reminders, left at deli, back door, uniform change, 7:20. Mason runs solo Thursdays. He burned what he no longer needed. He kept the rest like a liturgy. His world narrowed to details, timetables, weights, breath counts. He practiced his breathing until it was a machine. Inhale, hold 2, exhale. The counting anchored him. The breathing that had betrayed him in nightmares became his tether. In the silence between plans he could hear it, loud and faithful. In holdout, he learned to steady his pulse against it. There were moments of absurd normalcy. He visited the grocery store at noon. He watched a toddler drop a cookie and howl. He felt nothing. Outside, life continued. A cruel contrast. Playground laughter. A dog barking. A woman calling for a cab. He smiled once, a twitch that felt foreign, then folded the warmth away. The house where his father had eaten burned rice waited in stillness, and the jar in the kitchen labeled Dream Fund seemed both obscene and holy. Then came the first strike. He could have chosen any of them. He chose Harlan first because power had a scent and Harlan reeked of it. Harlan's mistakes were public, his arrogance predictable. He drank at the same bar every Thursday, proud in a way that made it easy. The approach was clinical. A phone pinged a burner number with a photo table at the rear, third stool from the corner. A shadow detached itself from the wall, then another. 2 men, faces half hidden beneath hoods, hands empty. The son watched from the next room, listening to the bar's murmured lull. The clink of glass, the soft country song warbling from the speakers. Harlan laughed too loudly. He raised his glass. Everyone looked away. That was the plan. Isolation through confidence. The son waited until Harlan's back turned to the alley window. He moved like a thought. No swagger, no proclamation. Just a coat, a step. The world limited to breath and the scrape of shoes on concrete. He cornered Harlan at the alley, where the fluorescent light above the door flickered like a failing eye. The cop smelled of cheap aftershave and stale beer. He blinked twice, waited for the punchline. The son did not give one. There was a hesitation, a small human flinch. Harlan's hand hovered on the knife in his boot. The son watched the motion and, for a fraction of time, felt the old moral knot pull at his chest. A man's life in the balance, a father's blood on his hands. The weight of both pressed down. He didn't think of justice. He thought of the gunshot that had taken his father, the headlines that had taken his name. He thought of all the times his father had said, without dramatics, "Keep your hands where I can see them." The line between instruction and irony trembled. For a second, time slowed. He could have walked away. The mirror of his past reflected an alternate life, a son who forgave, who sought courts and truth, who aged into the hollow kindness of a man who lost someone and learned to carry it. The mirror offered a harmless future, a slow burn of grief. He saw it, briefly, and then the image fractured. Something in him had hardened beyond returning. He pulled the gun. The shot was quieter than he expected, more punctual. It fit into the night like a nail into wood. Harlan crumpled against the dumpster. A heavy sound, a thud that filled the alleyway and swallowed the little country song. There was no cinematic struggle, just the small, honest ending of a man who had underestimated another. For a moment, the sun stood over him, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, casting a thin blue halo. The blinking light of the bar's exit sign hummed in a steady rhythm and off, on. The motif wrapped the scene like a cold hand. Then silence, absolute sudden. It wasn't a comforting silence. It was the kind that waits, patient and watchful. He listened for footsteps, for shouts, for the clack of radios. Only the distant hum of the city replied, only his own breathing, measured and machine-like. Inhale, hold, exhale. His hands shook once, then stopped. He wiped his palms on his jacket as if tidying a table. He folded the gun into the inner seam, an intimate, grim prayer. He moved out of the alley like a man who had slipped out of himself. The aftermath was quieter than he anticipated. When he reached home, he locked the door with a slow, methodical motion. He stood in the kitchen under the warm hum of the lamp and for a second could almost feel his father there still, patient, telling him in a memory to wash his hands. He washed his hands. Water ran gold under the kitchen light. Blood was not on his skin. It was elsewhere. It had been collected, moved, and stored in the concrete of the alley. Yet the sound of running water felt ceremonial. He let the faucet run until it steamed the cold air from his fingers. Then came the breathing motif, again his breath. Then the house's thin exhale, as though the building itself had been holding its own. He sat at the table where his father once sat and put his head in his hands. The room hummed with ordinary noises, a distant siren, a car passing, the refrigerator's steady click. Each sound felt obscene. He had become the thing he promised not to be. In the cramped sanctuary of that kitchen, the morality fracture widened into a canyon. He tasted triumph and ash together. He tasted his father's name, swallowed and gone. Outside, a protest choked the square candles, voices, signs. Somewhere, someone chanted his father's name. The world had not stopped for his action. It had continued its noisy procession, indifferent and vitalizing. He stared at the cracked reflection in the broken mirror across the room. The shards caught the kitchen light and fractured his face into many small, deliberate pieces. He was a man divided, hunter and son, justice and vengeance. The breathing patterns steady, the motif relentless. He had taken the first step. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And in the silence that followed, his breath was the loudest thing in the house. The first kill was meant to send a message. Instead, it awoke the machine. By morning, the news broke, not the truth, never the truth. Veteran officer found dead in alley, suspected gang retaliation. The words spread across every local screen, every paper, every whisper in town. The photo of Harlan wasn't the man slumped behind a dumpster. It was a smiling father in uniform, medals glinting on his chest, flanked by children in baseball caps. The narrative was clear. A hero slain, justice demanded. The system tightened. Internal investigations formed, but not into Harlan's past brutality. They were into him, the son. The Mafia connections whispered in the right ears. Anonymous tips, files opened and marked with red tabs. The DA Paul Weston stood before cameras, voice heavy with solemn conviction. This act of violence will not go unanswered. We are escalating resources to ensure every officer is protected, and we will pursue those responsible with full force. His eyes betrayed nothing, not fear, not guilt, only calculation. The gears of survival turning. The press obeyed. Articles painted the death as the beginning of a war on police. The murdered father was buried under headlines. His son became a shadow, a suspect before his name was ever spoken aloud. Community leaders begged for calm. The police demanded compliance. The mayor nodded through both. And still, in the streets, whispers grew louder. They killed him first. Why should we stay quiet? Candlelight vigils lit corners of the city. Mothers held photos of sons gone too soon. Children clutched signs with words scrawled in shaky handwriting. Justice for him. Chants filled the night. No justice. No peace. Over and over, until throats were raw and air itself seemed to vibrate. The son stood among them once, hood drawn low, silent in the crowd. He felt the warmth of candlelight against his face, saw tears glisten in strangers' eyes. But then came the riot shields. Rows of cops in black armor, faceless behind visors, batons heavy at their sides. A line of blinking red lights from their recording helmets cut through the night. each flicker echoing the dashcam that had failed his father. When Chance met Shields, silence cracked, rubber bullets, gas, screams mixing with smoke. The crowd scattered, leaving candles crushed beneath boots, their wax smearing the pavement like blood. The machine did not sleep. Every night, news anchors repeated the same script. Aggression escalating, public safety at risk. Every morning, op-eds echoed the DA's words. This is not justice. This is lawlessness. The officers tightened ranks. Patrols doubled. Cars idled longer outside his block. He felt eyes on him constantly, shadows in windows, whispers on corners. And he learned a bitter truth. His war was not with 3 men. It was with everything that allowed them to exist. Even in his own circle, cracks appeared. One ally from the underworld, a courier who had moved phones for him. Days later he learned why. The man had been picked up, held overnight, released with quiet threats. The next evening the cops knew too much about his roots, his hiding places. Someone had talked, someone close. Betrayal stung sharper than grief. He stopped meeting allies face. He used burner phones, shifting numbers daily, his voice low and clipped. Trust was no longer currency, it was poison. The shadows thickened. The walls closed in. Still, the hunt continued. Derek O'Neill, the ambitious one, was next. He was cautious, careful, always watching. But ambition creates patterns. He dined at the same diner each morning, ordered the same meal, left at the same time. The sun studied him for weeks, rehearsing the strike. Every hesitation, every mirror glance, every shift of the hand toward the holster. One night he followed Derek home. The cop's car rolled into a driveway, headlights dying. Derek lingered outside, lighting a cigarette, staring at the quiet street as though searching for absolution in its silence. The sun raised the gun from the shadows, hands steady. But hesitation gripped him again. Derek's silhouette shifted, so ordinary, so human. A tired man, chasing promotion, telling himself lies until they hardened into truth. For a moment, the sun saw his own reflection in Derek's posture, ambition twisted by a system that rewarded silence. The gun trembled. He lowered it, watched Derek finish his cigarette, stamp it out, walk inside. The kill would wait, and the hesitation would haunt him. The war turned inward. Insomnia deepened. He heard every creak of floorboards, every click of pipes, every whisper of wind against the window as if it were betrayal walking in. He paced, smoked, scribbled notes in the margins of old newspapers. He whispered his father's name into silence until the sound felt foreign. The system resisted, not only with shields and lies, but with erosion grinding him down, blurring his sense of time, morality, self. Then violence burst again. At another protest, riot cops descended. A teenager fell, baton splitting skin. The son moved without thought, dragging the boy to safety, shielding him with his body. The boy's blood slicked his shirt, warm, too familiar. The crowd roared, surged, pushed against shields. A smoke canister rolled across asphalt, spewing white clouds. He coughed, eyes burning, vision blurred. And in that moment, half blind, half choking, he remembered his father's last breath. The sound of it, the weight of it. When the smoke cleared, he was gone from the crowd, slipped into alleys, vanished into the dark. But something inside him sharpened again. Hesitation burned away by fire and gas. The DA doubled down. Press conferences turned venomous. Weston's voice rose with controlled fury. These so-called vigilantes seek chaos, but we will not let thugs rewrite justice. Behind the podium, his smile was thin. His numbers in the polls climbed. Every lie polished his crown. The son watched one broadcast in silence, cigarette smoke curling around the TV glow. Weston's words were smooth, practiced, safe, and in that moment, the son no longer saw a man. He saw the system's face. Not fists, not guns, but survival, self-preservation at all costs. Days bled into weeks. The resistance grew sharper, louder. Every alley felt like a trap. Every whisper might be betrayal. Allies thinned. Enemies multiplied. The son's reflection fractured further. Sometimes he barely recognized himself as bloodshot, skin sallow, jaw clenched until it ached. He no longer felt grief. Only momentum. Only the inevitability of the next step. The machine resisted. But machines, he reminded himself, break. And yet, the dread was constant. It followed him into every room, into every shadow, into every blink of light. When silence fell, it was never peace. It was the hum of the system tightening, the press spinning, the DA smirking, the cops waiting. And beneath it all, his breath, always his breath. Inhale, hold, exhale, louder than the news anchors, louder than the chants, louder than the lies. The war was no longer his choice. It had become his inheritance, and it would not stop until the machine itself bled. The machine resisted, but machines break, and sometimes they break in the quietest places. The night of reckoning was not announced. It was not planned with speeches or banners. It came in silence, the kind of silence that breathes heavy against your neck and makes the world shrink to a single pulse. An abandoned warehouse, rusted beams, broken windows, walls streaked with decades of rain. A single fluorescent light buzzed above, flickering, stuttering, casting the room into strobe-like shadows, on, off, on, off. The motif returned, cruel and constant. The sun stood in that light, gun heavy in his hand. His breath echoed in the emptiness. Inhale, hold, exhale. Across the room, chained to a chair, sat Officer Derek O'Neill, ambitious, cautious, silent. His tie was gone, shirt torn, face bruised from the abduction, yet his eyes still burned with something sharp, not fear, but calculation, the kind of calculation that had kept him alive through complicity. And in the corner, dragged from the comfort of his polished office, Paul Weston, suit ruined, hands bound, lips pressed into a thin line. Even now, even broken, he looked like a man rehearsing, calculating how this moment might play in the polls. The son's voice broke the silence. "You killed my father." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They carried weight heavier than gunfire. Derek's jaw clenched. "I didn't pull the trigger." The son stepped closer. The light blinked overhead, freezing his face in half shadow. "You held him down." Weston shifted, his voice polished even in the dark. "Listen, you don't want to do this. You think this will bring him back. You think this makes you different from us." The son turned, the barrel of the gun swinging. Silence pressed harder. For a moment he almost faltered, because Weston was right. The memory crashed in his father on the ground, blood spreading in rainwater, whispering, "I got a son," and now here he was. A son with a gun, a man about to pull a trigger into another man's chest. The question cut deeper than the weapon itself. Had he become the thing that killed his father? Was he not resisting? Was he not using fear as currency, silence as power? The breathing grew louder, heavy, broken. He stared at Derek, just a man in a chair, ribs cracked, sweat dripping. He stared at Weston, just another man in a ruined suit, lies bleeding from his lips. They weren't monsters. They weren't demons. They were men, human, fragile. And yet, so was his father. The hesitation fractured. The rage filled the cracks. "Differences," he whispered, voice trembling. "I don't lie about what I am." The shot thundered. Derek jerked, head snapping back, body slumping in the chair. Blood pooled beneath him, dark, slow, glistening in the flicker of the light. The sound lingered, bouncing between the warehouse walls until it died into silence. The son's hands trembled, then stilled. His breath slowed. Inhale, hold, exhale. Weston's face broke for the first time. No polish, no calculation, just naked fear. "You're finished," he said, voice cracking. "You'll die for this." The son stepped closer, crouching until his face was inches away. His eyes burned. So did he. Weston shook his head violently, desperation breaking the mask. "I didn't pull the trigger. I didn't." The son cut him off with a whisper. "You buried him for the first time." Weston's words faltered. The polished speeches dried up. There was nothing left to spin. He was just a man cornered in a flickering room, sweating, waiting for the inevitable. The son pressed the barrel to his forehead. The silence stretched, thick, unbearable. And in that silence, the son saw everything. The dinner table, the jar of coins labeled Dream Fund, his father's crooked smile, his cautious driving, his last breath on the roadside. He felt the weight of every vigil, every chant, every child holding a sign with shaky hands. And he felt the fracture were justice on one side, vengeance on the other. The breathing roared in his ears, his father's, his own, theirs. Finally he lowered the gun. Weston gasped, relief flooding his face. But the son wasn't finished. He cut the DA's bonds with a knife, tossed him to the ground. Weston scrambled, confused, terrified. "You'll live," the son said. His voice was flat, final. "But everyone will know what you are." He pulled out a flash drive bodycam fragments. Witness recordings files leaked from the underworld. Evidence Weston thought erased forever. He tossed it onto the DA's chest. "You die in the dark, or you burn in the light. Your choice." Weston's hand shook as he clutched the drive. His lips parted, but no words came. For the first time in his career, speech abandoned him. The son turned, walking into the shadows. His footsteps echoed against steel beams, fading with each breath. Behind him, the light flickered on off. The last image seared into the DA's mind. the silhouette of a man who had become hunter, jury, executioner, and left him alive, not out of mercy, but cruelty. The warehouse was silent again. Derek's body slumped. Weston sat in a pool of his own sweat, clutching the drive like a poisoned chalice, and the sun disappeared into the night. Victory was hollow. There was no triumph in the blood on his hands, no justice in the silence that followed, only a deep, gnawing emptiness. He walked the streets alone, the city's lights fractured through tears he didn't notice. People passed, unaware of what had happened in the warehouse, unaware of the storm that had broken. The machine still turned. The headlines would still spin, protests would still be crushed, and yet something had shifted. Not justice, not peace, but a wound opened wide enough for truth to bleed through. The son sat alone in his father's kitchen that night. The lamp hummed overhead. The jar labeled Dream Fund sat untouched. He placed the gun on the table, staring at it until the room blurred. His father's ghost lingered not in words, not in visions, but in silence. The silence of a man who had always known the road ended here. The son whispered into the emptiness. "Did I do it right?" The silence answered. Not with approval, not with condemnation, just with the heavy breathing of a house that remembered. The victory was his. But it tasted like ash. And in that moment, he realized the truth. He had not escaped his father's killers. He had become one. Victory tasted like ash. And ash does not fade. It lingers. It stains. The sun had broken the machine's gears, but not its spine. Derek O'Neill's corpse cooled in the shadows of the warehouse. Weston walked free, but branded by evidence that could undo him, evidence that might one day crawl into daylight. Yet none of it felt like triumph. The son wandered home like a man returned from war, but there was no parade, no embraces, only silence. The gun sat on the table, staring at him like an accusation. His father's jar, the Dream Fund, still glimmered with coins in the low lamplight. He lifted the jar once, shook it, listened to the hollow rattle, and for the first time, he wept. Not for justice, not for vengeance, but for everything that had been lost in the name of both. The city outside did not heal. It fractured. Protests swelled, candlelight vigils multiplying until whole streets glowed with flames trembling against the night air. Mothers chanted until their voices cracked. Children raised fists too small for the weight they carried, and the police answered with force. Armored trucks rolled down cracked asphalt. Sirens wailed over the chants. Gas hissed into crowds. Candles extinguished under boots. Men and women scattered through alleys, coughing, eyes burning, their signs trampled. Every night ended the same. Shattered glass, blood on pavement, silence broken by the hum of helicopters. The town had become a wound drawer, open, unhealing, and through it all whispers spread of the son. Some called him a savior, the avenger who gave back what the system stole. Others called him a criminal, a shadow assassin no better than those he hunted. But none called him whole, because vengeance had stripped him bare. He stopped sleeping entirely. Nights stretched into endless pacing, his breath the only rhythm left in the house. Inhale, hold, exhale. The motif beat in his ears like a drum, louder than the protests, louder than the sirens. He looked in the cracked mirror again, but this time, no father's ghost, no son's reflection, only fragments, a man in pieces, none of which belonged together anymore. He tried to remember his father's laugh, the sound of burnt rice scraping from a pan, but even those memories felt tainted now, coated in gunpowder, stained by blood. Justice had not restored him, it had devoured him. Days blurred. Reports came of Weston's downfall, files leaked, recordings surfaced, his voice, smug, polished, damning played across television screens, his career unraveling in real time. The son watched without satisfaction. Weston was finished, yes, but so was he. He had wanted justice. What he held instead was ruin. The town tried to memorialize the father. On a cracked brick wall near the center of the square, a mural appeared. A portrait painted in blues and grays, the father's face staring outward, eyes weary but unbroken. Around it, candles flickered in silence, wax dripping into rivers along the concrete. Every night, people gathered there. Some prayed, some cried, some just stood in silence, letting the flamelight wash across their faces. The son went once. He stood at the edge of the crowd, hooed low, watching as strangers whispered his father's name. Children touched the mural's face as though it might breathe warmth back into them. For a moment, his chest tightened, not with pride, with grief, with the realization that this was all that remained. A wall, a flame, a name painted over cracks that could never be sealed. He turned away. The candles flickered behind him, their flames swaying in the wind. His father's mural blurred as he walked. the image dissolving into shadows. The breath motif returned louder now, overwhelming. His father's last inhale on that rainy road, his own exhale in the warehouse, the city's breath in protest chants and screams. Everything was breath, everything was silence after breath, and in that silence, the cost revealed itself. Revenge was complete. But the sun was broken, the town was broken, and the father remained dead. The house felt colder now, smaller. The kitchen lamp buzzed, casting the jar of coins into fractured glimmers. He sat at the table where his father once sat, staring at nothing, listening to his own breath until it felt foreign. Inhale, hold, exhale, a rhythm without music, a drumbeat without a march. The cost of justice was not victory, the cost was himself. Outside, the mural's candles flickered, one flame sputtered, then another, until only silence remained. Shut the fuck up, boy, hands where I can see them. The words that began this story still echo on dark roads across America. They do not fade. They repeat, again and again, each time a siren flares behind headlights, each time a black father grips a wheel too tightly, each time silence swallows a final breath. The sun's war left bodies, broken careers, and murals that flicker in candlelight, but the system remains. The machine still turns. New officers still patrol. New das still smile behind polished words. And somewhere, another father will be stopped. Another son will inherit rage. Another town will fracture. Because vengeance may silence men, but it cannot silence history. And in the end, the only sound left is breathing. Heavy, shattered, waiting. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, like, and share, and stay tuned for more stories.